Lenin on the State and Revolution, Chapter 5. The economic basis of the withering away of the state. Marx explains this question most thoroughly in his critique of the Gotha programme, in a letter to Brack, May the 5th, 1875, which was not published until 1891, when it was printed in the Newsite, volume 9, 1, and which has appeared in Russian in a separate edition. The polemical part of this remarkable work, which contains a criticism of Lassalleanism, has, so to speak, overshadowed its positive part, namely the analysis of the connection between the development of communism and the withering away of the state. Part 1. Presentation of the question by Marx. From a superficial comparison of Marx's letter to Brack of May the 5th, 1875, with Engels' letter to Bebel of March 28th, 1875, which we examined above, it might appear that Marx was much more of a champion of the state than Engels, that there was a very considerable difference of opinion between the two writers on the question of the state. Engels suggested to Bebel that all the chatter about the state be dropped altogether, that the word state be eliminated from the programme altogether, and the word community substituted for it. Engels even declared that the commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. Yet Marx even spoke of the nature of the future state of communist society, i.e. as though he recognised the need for the state even under communism. But such a view would be fundamentally wrong. A closer examination shows that Marx and Engels' views on the state and its withering away were completely identical, and that Marx's expression quoted above refers precisely to this nature of the state in the process of its withering away. Clearly, there can be no question of specifying the moment of the future withering away, the more so since it will obviously be a lengthy process. The apparent difference between Marx and Engels is explained by the fact that they dealt with different subjects and pursued different aims. Engels set out to show Bebel graphically, sharply, and in broad outline the utter absurdity of the current prejudices concerning the state, shared to no small degree by Lassalle. Marx only touched upon this question in passing, being interested in another subject, namely the development of communist society. The whole theory of Marx is the application of the theory of development, in its most consistent, complete, considered and pithy form, to modern capitalism. Naturally, Marx was faced with the problem of applying this theory both to the forthcoming collapse of capitalism and to the future development of future communism. On the basis of what data, then, can the question of the future development of future communism be posed? On the basis of the fact that it has its origin in capitalism, that it develops historically out of capitalism, that it is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism gave birth. There is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to make up a utopia, to make idle guesses about what cannot be known. Marx poses the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would pose the question of the development, say, of a new biological variety, once he knew that it had originated in such a way and was changing in such and such a definite direction. Marx, first of all, brushes aside the confusion the Gotha programme brings into the question of the relation between the state and society. He writes, "Present-day society is capitalist society which exists in all civilised countries more or less free from medieval admixture, more or less modified by the special historical development of each country, more or less developed. On the other hand, the present-day state changes with the country's frontier. It is different in the Prusso-German Empire from what it is in Switzerland. It is different in England from what it is in the United States. The present-day state is therefore a fiction. Nevertheless, the different states of the different civilized countries, in spite of their manifold diversity of form, all have this in common, that they are based on modern bourgeois society, only one more or less capitalistically developed. They have therefore also certain essential features in common. In this sense, it's possible to speak of the nature of the present-day state in contrast with the future in which its present root, bourgeois society, will have died off. The question then arises, what transformation will the nature of the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present functions of the state? This question can only be answered scientifically. One does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousandfold combination of the word people with the word state. Having thus ridiculed all talk about a people's state, Marx formulates the question and warns us, as it were, that a scientific answer to it can be secured only by using firmly established scientific data. The first fact that has been established with complete exactitude by the whole theory of development, by science as a whole, a fact that was forgotten by the utopians and is forgotten by the present-day opportunists who are afraid of the socialist revolution, is that historically there must undoubtedly be a special stage or a special phase of transition from capitalism to communism. Part 2, the transition from capitalism to communism. Marx continues, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. There corresponds to this also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx bases this conclusion on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the development of this society, and the irreconcilability of the antagonistic interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Previously, the question was put in this way. In order to achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and establish its revolutionary dictatorship. Now the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society, which is developing towards communism, to a communist society, is impossible without a political transition period. And the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What then is the relationship of this dictatorship to democracy? We've seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts, to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class and to win the battle of democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favourable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in essence, a democracy for the minority, only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics. Freedom for the slave owners. Owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that they cannot be bothered with democracy, they cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life. The correctness of this statement is perhaps most clearly confirmed by Germany, precisely because in that country, constitutional legality steadily endured for a remarkably long time, for nearly half a century, from 1871 to 1914. And during this period, social democracy there was able to achieve far more than in other countries in the way of utilising legality, and organised a larger proportion of the workers into a political party than anywhere else in the world. What is this largest proportion of politically conscious and active wage slaves that has so far been observed in capitalist society? 1 million members of the Social Democratic Party out of 15 million wage workers. 3 million organised in trade unions out of 15 million. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is a democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we shall see everywhere, in the petty, supposedly petty, details of the suffrage, residential qualification, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly, public buildings are not for beggars, in the purely capitalist organisation of the daily press, etc., etc., we shall see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor, seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has never known want himself, and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life. And 9/10, if not 99/100ths, of the bourgeois publicists and politicians of this category. But in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics, from active participation in democracy. Marx grasped this essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analysing the experience of the commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament. But from this capitalist democracy, that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor, and is therefore hypocritical and false to the core, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly towards greater and greater democracy, as conceived by the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists. No, forward development, i.e. development towards communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the organisation of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class, for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Alongside an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags, the dictatorship of the proletariat brings about a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. The resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that where there is suppression, where there is violence, there is no freedom and no democracy. Engels expressed this splendidly in his letter to Bebel, when he said, as the reader will remember, that the proletariat uses the state not in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. Democracy for the vast majority of people and suppression by force, i.e. exclusion from democracy of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. Only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists has already been completely crushed, when the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e. when there is no difference between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a really complete democracy become possible and be achieved. A democracy really without any exceptions. And only then will democracy begin to wither away, owing to the simple fact that freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of community life that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus of coercion which is called the state. The expression, the state withers away, is very well chosen, for it indicates both the gradualness of the process and its spontaneous nature. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect. For we see around us on millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the rules of community life that are indispensable to them when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that rouses indignation, evokes protest and revolt, and recreates the need for suppression. Thus, in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false. A democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the minority, the exploiters. Communism alone is capable of giving really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the more quickly it will become unnecessary and wither away of itself. In other words, under capitalism, we have the state in the proper sense of the word. That is a special machine for the suppression of one class by another. And what is more, the majority by the minority. Naturally, to be successful, such an undertaking as a systematic suppression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in carrying out the suppression. It calls for seas of blood, through which mankind makes its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labour. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state is still necessary, but this is already a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of slaves, serfs or wage labourers, and it will cost mankind far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. The exploiters are naturally unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task. But the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, but a simple organisation of the armed masses, such as the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. Let us remark, running ahead somewhat. Lastly, only communism makes a state completely unnecessary, for there is nobody to be suppressed. Nobody in the sense of a class, in the sense of a systematic struggle against a definite section of the population. We are not utopians and do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses by individual persons, or the need to suppress such excesses. But in the first place, no special machine, no special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. It will be done by the armed people itself, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or to prevent a woman from being assaulted. And secondly, we know that the fundamental social cause of excesses, which consists in the violation of the rules of community life, is the exploitation of the masses, their want and their poverty. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. We do not know how quickly and in what succession, but we know that they will wither away. With their withering away, the state will also wither away. Without indulging in utopias, Marx defined in more detail what can be defined now regarding this future, namely the difference between the lower and higher phases, levels, stages of a communist society. Part 3, the first phase of communist society. In the critique of the Gotha programme, Marx refutes in detail Lassalle's idea that under socialism, the worker will receive the undiminished or full product of his labour. Marx shows that from the whole of the social labour of society, there must be deducted a reserve fund, a fund for the expansion of production, for the replacement of the wear and tear of machinery, and so on. Then, from the means of consumption, there must be deducted a fund for the expenses of administration, for schools, hospitals, homes for the aged, and so on. Instead of Lassalle's hazy, obscure general phrase, the full product of his labour to the worker, Marx gives a sober estimate of exactly how the socialist society will have to manage its affairs. Marx proceeds to make a concrete analysis of the conditions of life of a society in which there will be no capitalism, and says, quote, "What we have to deal with here in analysing the programme of the Workers' Party is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. And it is this communist society, a society which has just emerged into the light of day, out of the womb of capitalism, and which is in every respect stamped with the birthmarks of the old society, that Marx terms the first or lower phase of communist society. The means of production have already ceased to be the private property of individuals. The means of production belong to the whole of society. Every member of society performing a certain part of the socially necessary work receives a certificate from society to the effect that he has done such and such an amount of work. And with this certificate, he receives from the public store of articles of consumption a corresponding quantity of products. After a deduction is made of the amount of labour which goes to the public fund, every worker, therefore, receives from society as much as he has given to it. Equality apparently reigns supreme. But when Lassalle, having in view such a social order, usually called socialism but termed by Marx the first phase of communism, says that this is fair distribution, that this is the equal right of all to an equal product of labour, Lassalle is erring, and Marx explains his error. Equal right, says Marx, we indeed have here, but it is still a bourgeois right, which, like every right, presupposes inequality. Every right is an application of an equal measure to different people who in fact are not alike, are not equal to one another. That is why equal right is a violation of equality and injustice. Indeed, everyone having performed as much social labour as another receives an equal share of the social product after the above-mentioned deductions. But people are not alike. One is stronger, another is weaker. One is married, another is not. One has more children, another has less, and so on. And the conclusion Marx draws is, with an equal performance of labour and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, right instead of being equal would have to be unequal. Hence, the first phase of communism cannot yet provide justice and equality. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will remain, but the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible, because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, machines, land, etc., and make them private property. While smashing Lassalle's petty bourgeois vague phrases about equality and justice in general, Marx shows the course of development of communist society, which is compelled to abolish at first only the injustice of the means of production having been seized by individuals, and which is unable at once to eliminate the other injustice, which consists in the distribution of articles of consumption according to work, and not according to needs. The vulgar economists, including the bourgeois professors and our Tugan among them, constantly reproach the socialists with forgetting the inequality of people, with dreaming of eliminating this inequality. Such a reproach, as we see, only proves the extreme ignorance of Messrs. The bourgeois ideologists. Marx not only takes the most precise account of the inevitable inequality of men, but he also takes into account the fact that the mere conversion of the means of production into the common property of the whole of society, commonly called socialism, does not remove the defects of distribution and the inequality of bourgeois right, which continues to dominate insofar as products are divided according to work. Continuing, Marx says, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. And so, in the first phase of communist society, commonly called socialism, bourgeois right is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, i.e. only in respect of the means of production. Bourgeois right recognises them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois right falls away. However, it continues to exist as far as its other part is concerned. It continues to exist in the capacity of regulator, determining factor, in the distribution of products and the allotment of labour among the members of society. The socialist principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat, is already realised. The other socialist principle, an equal amount of products for an equal amount of labour, is also already realised. But this is not yet communism, and it does not yet abolish bourgeois right, which gives to unequal individuals, in return for really unequal amounts of labour, equal amounts of products. This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable in the first phase of communism. For if we are not to fall into utopianism, we must not think that having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any standard of right. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create the economic prerequisites for such a change. And there is no other standard than that of bourgeois right. To this extent, therefore, there still remains the need for a state, which, while safeguarding the public ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labour and equality in the distribution of products. The state withers away insofar as there are no longer any capitalists, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. But the state has not yet completely withered away, since there still remains the safeguarding of bourgeois right, which sanctifies actual inequality. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary. Part 4. The higher phase of communist society. Marx continues. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual, the division of labour, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labour, has vanished, after labour has become not only a means of life, but itself life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Only now can we appreciate to the full the correctness of Engels' remarks, in which he mercilessly ridiculed the absurdity of combining the words freedom and state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there will be freedom, there will be no state. The economic basis for the complete withering away of the state is such a high stage of development of communism that the antithesis between mental and physical labour disappears. And consequently, one of the principal sources of modern social inequality disappears. This source, moreover, cannot on any account be removed immediately by the mere conversion of the means of production into public property, by the mere expropriation of the capitalists. This expropriation will create the possibility of a gigantic development of the productive forces. And when we see how incredibly capitalism is already retarding this development, and how much progress could be achieved on the basis of the level of modern technique already attained, we are entitled to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in a gigantic development of the productive forces of human society. But how rapidly this development will proceed, how soon it will reach the point of breaking away from the division of labour, of doing away with the antithesis between mental and physical labour, of transforming labour into life's prime want, we do not know and cannot know. That is why we are entitled to speak only of the inevitable withering away of the state, emphasising the protracted nature of this process and its dependence upon the rapidity of development of the higher phase of communism, and leaving the question of the time required for, or the concrete forms of, the withering away entirely open, because there is no material for answering these questions. It will become possible for the state to wither away completely when society gives effect to the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, i.e. when people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of community life, and when their labour becomes so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois right, by which one is compelled to calculate with the callousness of a Shylock, lest one work half an hour more than somebody else, lest one receive less pay than somebody else. This narrow horizon will then be crossed. There will then be no need for society, in distributing products, to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs. From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare that such a social order is sheer utopia, and to sneer at the socialists for allegedly promising everyone the right to receive from society, without any control over the labour of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, automobiles, pianos, etc. Even to this day, most bourgeois savants confine themselves to such sneering, thereby displaying both their ignorance and their mercenary defence of capitalism. Ignorance, for it has never entered the head of any socialist to promise that the higher phase of the development of communism will arrive, whereas the great socialists, in foreseeing that it will arrive, presuppose not the present productivity of labour, and not the present ordinary one of people, who, like the seminary students in Pomyalovsky's stories, are capable of damaging the stocks of public wealth just for fun, and of demanding the impossible. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state of the measure of labour and the measure of consumption. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalists, and must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. The mercenary defence of capitalism by the bourgeois ideologists and their hangers-on, like Messrs. Tseretellis, Chernovs and company, consists precisely in that they substitute arguing and talk about the distant future for the vital and burning question of present-day politics, namely the expropriation of the capitalists, the conversion of all citizens into workers and employees of one huge syndicate, the whole state, and the complete subordination of the entire work of this syndicate to a genuinely democratic state, the state of the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. In essence, when a learned professor, followed by the Philistine, followed in turn by Messrs. the Tseretellis and Chernovs, talks of fantastic utopias, of the demagogic promises of the Bolsheviks, of the impossibility of introducing socialism, he has in mind the higher stage or phase of communism which no one has ever promised or even thought to introduce because it cannot be introduced at all. And this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, which Engels touched on in his above quoted argument about the incorrectness of the name Social Democrat. Politically, the distinction between the first or lower and the higher phase of communism will in time probably be tremendous. But it would be ridiculous to take cognizance of this distinction now under capitalism, and only individual anarchists, perhaps, could invest it with primary importance. If there still remain people among the anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanovite conversion of the Kropotkins, the Graves, or the Cornelissens, and other stars of anarchism into social chauvinists or anarcho-trenchists, as G, one of the few anarchists who have still preserved a sense of honour and a conscience, has put it. But the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear. What is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production become common property, the word communism is also applicable here, provided we do not forget that this is not complete communism. The great significance of Marx's explanations is that here too, he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the theory of development, and regards communism as something which develops out of capitalism. Instead of scholastically invented, concocted definitions and fruitless disputes about words, what is socialism, what is communism, Marx gives an analysis of what might be called the stages of the economic maturity of communism. In its first phase, or first stage, communism cannot as yet be fully mature economically and entirely free from traditions or vestiges of capitalism. Hence the interesting phenomenon that communism in its first phase retains the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. Of course, bourgeois right in regard to the distribution of articles of consumption inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state. For right is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the standards of right. It follows that under communism there remains for a time not only bourgeois right, but even the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. This may sound like a paradox or simply a dialectical conundrum of which Marxism is often accused by people who do not take the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. But in fact, remnants of the old surviving in the new confront us in life at every step, both in nature and in society. And Marx did not arbitrarily insert a scrap of bourgeois right into communism, but indicated what is economically and politically inevitable in a society emerging from the womb of capitalism. Democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in its struggle against the capitalists for its emancipation. But democracy is by no means a limit not to be overstepped. It is only one of the stages on the road from feudalism to capitalism and from capitalism to communism. Democracy means equality. The great significance of the proletariat struggle for equality and of the slogan of equality is clear if we correctly interpret it as meaning the abolition of classes. But democracy means only formal equality. And as soon as equality is achieved for all members of society in relation to ownership of the means of production, that is, equality of labour and equality of wages, humanity will inevitably be confronted with the question of advancing further, from formal equality to actual equality, i.e. to giving effect to the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. By what stages, by means of what practical measures humanity will proceed to this supreme aim, we do not and cannot know. But it is important to realise how infinitely mendacious is the ordinary bourgeois conception of socialism as something lifeless, petrified, fixed once for all, whereas in reality only with socialism there will begin a rapid, genuine, really mass-forward movement, embracing first the majority and then the whole of the population in all spheres of public and private life. Democracy is a form of the state, one of its varieties. Consequently, like every state, it represents the organised, systematic use of violence against persons. That is one aspect. But on the other hand, it signifies the formal recognition of equality of citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of the state and to administer it. This in turn is tied up with the fact that at a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first welds together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, the proletariat, and enables it to crush, smash to smithereens, wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the republican bourgeois state machine, the standing army, the police and the bureaucracy, and to substitute for it a more democratic state machine, but a state machine nevertheless, in the shape of the armed masses of workers who develop into a militia in which the entire population takes part. Here, quantity turns into quality. Such a degree of democracy is tied up with overstepping the bounds of bourgeois society, with the beginning of its socialist reconstruction. If really all take part in the administration of the state, capitalism cannot retain its hold. And the development of capitalism, in its turn, creates the prerequisites that enable really all to take part in the administration of the state. Some of these prerequisites are universal literacy, which has already been achieved in a number of the most advanced capitalist countries. Then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, socialised apparatus of the postal service, railways, big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc., etc. Given these economic prerequisites, it is quite possible, after the overthrow of the capitalists and the bureaucrats, to proceed immediately, overnight, to replace them in the control of production and distribution, in the work of keeping account of labour and products, by the armed workers, by the universally armed people. The question of control and accounting should not be confused with the question of the scientifically trained staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen are working today at the bidding of the capitalists, and they will work even better tomorrow at the bidding of the armed workers. Accounting and control. That is the main thing needed to achieve the smooth working, the correct functioning of the first phase of communist society. All citizens are transformed here into hired employees of the state, which consists in the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single nationwide state syndicate. The whole issue is that they should work equally, do their assigned share of work and get equally paid. The accounting and control necessary for this have been simplified by capitalism to the extreme and reduced to the extraordinarily simple operations which any literate person can perform, of supervising and recording, knowledge of the 4 rules of arithmetic, and issuing appropriate receipts. When the majority of the people begin independently and everywhere to keep such accounts and exercise such control over the capitalists, now converted into employees, and over Messrs the intellectuals who preserve their capitalist ways, this control will really become universal, general, and popular. There'll be no getting away from it. There'll be nowhere to go. The whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of labour and equality of pay. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat, after defeating the capitalists and overthrowing the exploiters, will extend to the whole of society, is by no means our ideal, nor is it our ultimate goal. It is but a necessary step for radically purging society of all the infamies and abominations of capitalist exploitation, and for further progress. From the moment all members of society, or at least the vast majority, have learned to administer the state themselves, have taken this work into their own hands, have set going the control over the insignificant minority of capitalists, over the lordlings who wish to preserve their capitalist ways, and over the workers who have been profoundly corrupted by capitalism. From this moment, the need for government of any kind begins to disappear altogether. The more complete the democracy, the nearer the moment approaches when it becomes unnecessary. The more democratic the state, which consists of the armed workers, and which is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, the more rapidly does every kind of state begin to wither away. For when all have learned to administer and actually do independently administer social production, independently keep accounts, and exercise control over the parasites, the sons of privilege, the swindlers and such like, guardians of capitalist traditions, the escape from this popular accounting and control will inevitably become so incredibly difficult, such a rare exception, and will probably be accompanied by such swift and severe punishment, for the armed workers are practical people and not sentimental intellectuals, and they will scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them, that the necessity of observing the simple fundamental rules of all human community life will very soon become a habit. And then the door will be thrown wide open for the transition from the first phase of communist society to its higher phase, and with it the complete withering away of the state.